Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. You can see that everyone's coming in from the waiting room now. So I think we will just wait a minute or two to let everyone join the meeting. But just a reminder that this meeting is recorded. So please feel free to send your messages in the chat. Keep your microphone off while the speakers are talking, and we'll have some Q&A sessions at the end. So we'll just wait another minute while everyone joins. Okay, so I think we can get started now, at least with the introduction. Thank you very much for joining us here today for our event reporting on supply chain sustainability. We're happy to have companies here from across all the Nordics, as this event is a collaboration between the UN Global Compact networks in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. So we're very happy to have this partnership. And thank you also to our speakers who are joining us today from Europe and the US, from a variety of organizations who can speak very well on supply chain sustainability and reporting. And then just one more reminder that the event is recorded. We will share the recording and the slides with you after the event. And during the event, please feel free to share your questions via the chat to all of the speakers. And we have two Q&A sessions, one for the first part of the event, which will focus on the social aspect, and one for the second part of the event, which will focus on the environmental aspect. So again, thank you so much for joining. I'll pass the event now to Knut Moestue, our COO here at UN Global Compact Norway, for some opening remarks. So Knut, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alison. Thank you all for showing up today and more to come. I think most of you know the UN Global Compact by now, but still, if you don't, we are the world's largest sustainability business organization, and we work to include many different areas of sustainability, and we talk to a wide variety and give a platform to a wide variety of professionals. Today, we're going to focus a lot on supply chain. So as most of us know, a lot of our sustainability issues will be in scope 3, and it's important to engage with our supply chain. And we, as the UN Global Compact, want to be part of that engagement and help the companies, how can you say, have success with that engagement. But as reporting on corporate sustainability is becoming a standard practice across companies in the Nordics, it is vital that reporting also extends beyond the company's own operations and into its value chain. With the introduction of Norway's recent Transparency Act, based on the UK Modern Slavery Act, which requires companies to report on due diligence assessment on human rights and labor, and the growing number of scope 3 emission reduction targets set through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. If you haven't set science-based targets, please sign on to our Climate Ambition Accelerator. That was a parenthesis there. It is clear that companies must now engage their value chains to keep up with the latest regulations and standards. This is why we are happy to have speakers with us today who will cover reporting on supply chain sustainability both from a social and an environmental angles or impact assessment. The first part of today's event, we will look at human rights and decent work in supply chains, with the presentation from Marie-Lou Dupont, Senior Management of Decent Work and Social Sustainability at the UN Global Compact headquarters. The second part of today's event will focus on the environmental aspect with an overview of CDP's questionnaire and supply chain program with Hugo Ernest Jones, Associate Director of Supply Chain Europe at CDP. We will also get a company example from Velux with David Collins, Supplier Quantity and Development Director. And finally, we will look at the Science-Based Targets Initiative Scope 3 criteria with Kenza Taufik. She is European Regional Lead for CDP's Commit to Action program. So with those words, for those of you who don't know, we will do a Q&A session at the end. I've already introduced the question to the speakers about the impact assessment and closer collaboration on the impact assessment. So I'm looking forward to hear their answers and maybe get some new information in this chat. So over to you, Alison, I think, or?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Knut, for the opening remarks and setting the stage. Yes, as you said, we're looking forward to our first speaker, Marie-Lou Dupont, who is Senior Manager of Decent Work and Social Sustainability at UN Global Compact, where she leads the Decent Work in Global Supply Chains Action Platform. And this is an alliance of companies, global compact networks, and international partners who are committed to leveraging their supply chains and taking action on addressing decent work deficits. So Marie-Lou has extensive experience working with responsible business through organizations such as UN Global Compact and OECD. So we're really looking forward to hearing her input on how companies can address and report on human rights and decent work across their supply chains. So Marie-Lou, we'll hand it to you now.
Thank you, Alison, and hi, everyone. I'm speaking to you from New York, where our global office is located, and I'm really happy to be, up early to address some of the issues that Knut kindly reminded us. So today, I would like to focus on the social principles of the UN Global Compact, some of the key elements of our new communication on progress, our accountability system at the UN Global Compact, and some lessons learned from 4 years of work within the Decent Work in Global Supply Chain Action Platform. So as was described a bit earlier, the UN Global Compact calls company to adopt a principle-based approach, which means integrating or placing the 10 principles at the heart of their strategies and operations. For that, participants who sign up to the UN Global Compact make an explicit commitment to respect and support human rights. So for those of you who already engage with the UN Global Compact, you know, or maybe now you will, that the CEO write a commitment letter to the Secretary General of the UN, specifically committing to upholding the 10 principles. Human rights is also quite key to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. 92% of all targets are linked to international human rights instruments. And when I speak about human rights, I also do include labor rights. As you can imagine, obviously, child labor is both a human rights and a labor right. And when we talk about human rights due diligence, for example, we also do include actions on working conditions, for instance. Today, I wanted to expand a little bit on human rights principles, our human rights principles, and how they align with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. As was mentioned earlier, there is quite a big, I would say, movement or push for more for mandatory due diligence in Europe mostly, but also elsewhere, with different legislations being enacted by different countries. One of the latest being in Norway, obviously. Most of you know that already, the Transparency Act, or I believe it can also be called the Human Rights and Due Diligence, the Human Rights and Decent Work Due Diligence Law, or something along those lines, which is quite interesting for me as a decent work senior manager, that decent work is specifically included in that bucket. But it follows also a line of due diligence law, which integrate this idea of due diligence. So looking at risks and impact in a company's own operations, but also along the supply chains. And as you can imagine, this is for most companies one of the biggest challenge that they face in the sustainability within their sustainability approach. So our principles, two first principles, are focusing on human rights. They predate the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but in essence, they actually align perfectly with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And for those of you who are not that familiar with the UN Global Compact, the 4 labor principles are covering freedom of association and collective bargaining, forced labor, child labor, and discrimination in the workplace. So the 4 principles are basically the International Labor Organization fundamental principles and rights at work. The UN guiding principles are divided in 3 pillars. The first pillar is looking at the duty to protect. So this is the part that government should be covering, right? The second part is what is focusing on the responsibility of business. And the third pillar, which is the one that is often less, I wouldn't say less known, but a bit more difficult to master, is access to a remedy for victims of business related abuses. In terms of human rights due diligence, what we actually mean by that is we mean that it's the baseline for expectations of all businesses, right? It's an independent responsibility of businesses to respect human rights. This applies to companies of all size, and as I said, it extends to the supply chains. The UN guiding principles are quite clear on what is included in the different steps that is included in due diligence, which is often reflected in the legislation that we see in different countries. So the policy commitment, the actual process of due diligence, which includes understanding the supply chain, mapping the supply chain, identifying salient risks, and then acting on them. And then the grievance mechanism part, which is the last piece of the due diligence process or processes. I just want to go here. And I also wanted to include that first part on the government responsibilities and this idea of a smart mix. Maybe some of you have heard of that expression before, a mix of different policies, expectations, voluntary principles, but also national mandatory legislation. Given the context that we have in Norway, in other countries, and for those of you who follow the development of those legislations, 2 examples of laws that align pretty well with the human rights due diligence processes as stated or as developed in the UN guiding principles are the French vigilance law, which focus not only on human rights, but all aspects of business ethics, with the obligation of developing a plan on how to address human rights and other risks. And the new German law as well, which are 2 examples of law that goes rather than just, for example, modern slavery for the UK or child labor for the Netherlands, but all do apply this due diligence idea. At the UN Global Compact, we do include obviously these important elements. We are currently in the midst of developing a new strategy, which is going to go into effect next year. And in terms of the priorities that we'll be looking at is what you see on the screen. We'll be really very much focusing on human rights, labor, climate change, gender equality, governance, anti-corruption, and SDG integration. Those will be in some ways they already are, but they will be the biggest focus of our work starting next year, with human rights focusing on due diligence processes and addressing the gap between policies and implementation. And there is, in effect, a pretty big gap that we observe through our survey, through our engagement with companies. Even the most advanced companies do struggle to make the implementations from policies in the supply chain, for example. So this is going to be quite a big challenge for all of us in the coming years, to move from those big policies that are important, but that should be just the first step, to actually be able to understand a supply chain, identifying and acting on those risks. Part of the new strategy is also revising our own accountability system. We'll be having a new communication on progress with clear expectations on how to implement the 10 principles. This is going to come into effect only in 2023. And the big change, if you're already part of the UN Global Compact, is that this new communication on progress will be applicable to all companies of all sizes. Everyone will have an obligation on top of the commitment from the CEO to report on those indicators. There is obviously a big need to align with existing framework, and we have experts from CDP coming after this presentation, but there is obviously a really big effort to align with existing frameworks, CDP being one, but also GRI for instance. But that being said, in the social space, for those of you who do report, we don't have tons of indicators on human rights and labor. So we do have new indicators to cover for our social principles. Otherwise, most of our indicators align with existing frameworks, recognizing the need to not create any additional burden for companies in reporting on our 10 principles. The social principles focus on the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework, which were developed based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I don't have much time, but I just wanted to say a few words on the Decent Work in Global Supply Chain Action Platform, which, as Alison mentioned, is a coalition of companies, local networks, and partners, the International Labour Organization, UNICEF, and the Global Deal. We've been looking for 4 years at the biggest challenges for companies in addressing human rights and labor rights in their supply chains. And one of the big chunk, or the big piece that we first addressed, which ended up being a work of 2 years with a lot of engagement and led to the development of a toolkit, was how to bring together procurement staff and sustainability strategy, recognizing that procurement staff or procurement colleagues are at the forefront of how risks can be understood and again addressed in supply chains, but often are disconnected from the bigger sustainability strategy and do have a lot of pressure that is not a good match for sustainability implementation, right? Pressure of price, pressure of deadlines, pressure of certain suppliers that might not be compliant but have a historic relationship, for example, with the company. All those elements that makes it difficult for procurement to actually make choices based on human rights and labor rights standards and expectations, and enable an environment where decent work can actually happen, where living wage can actually be provided, when occupational safety and health is a priority that is disconnected from those pressure linked to time and deadlines and all these things. And these are examples of products that we've developed over the years. The Decent Work Toolkit for Sustainable Procurement all address gaps that were identified by companies who are involved in the action platform. Companies that you know, it's no secret, everything is transparent. Companies like Unilever, like L'Oréal, like Schneider Electric, like UPM, multinational enterprises that do face those same issues. I think you will all have access to these slides for more details on what these tools and guidance entail. And I believe that my time might be up. Allison, is that right?
Yes, I think we can take some time to go through the tools. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to share in the chat as well. But I think it's great that you covered the communication on progress. So that's especially important for members of UN Global Compact. And we also looked at the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework. And then we have these tools. But I think for some companies, they might be interested in knowing, as an SME, for example, and they want to take the first step on reporting on human rights and labor, due diligence, with different regulations coming out, like Norway's Transparency Act. What are some of your advice for taking the first steps on working on these things?
So the new communication on progress really does try to address exactly that. So how companies who may not have reported before on human rights and labor rights, how do they get started? So this new communication on progress has really clear expectations on how you should be doing due diligence, for example, with the different steps. So for a company who is looking at understanding its own role on human rights, then they have all the expectations in the communication on progress. Well, normally when you're at the stage of reporting, you should already be doing all these things. But in this case, communication on progress is also a way for us to share how these processes should be done. So then companies can report on them appropriately. In terms of human rights, for example, and other topics, we do have a section in the, I'm just going to go back actually, just a little bit. We do have a whole section that is called Governance Framework, which starts with just setting the scene on your sustainability journey, right? What type of engagement do you have in the board? Where does this strategy comes from? The advice is obviously that a sustainability strategy comes from the top, right? So that it can be applied to all units within a company, and you do have a coherence so that you know that you have the freedom or the liberty to actually make decisions based on those principles that the company has. Do you have any system in place, for example, to assess how well the strategy is being implemented across teams? Is due diligence just confined on one specific topic? For example, addressing child labor. Sometimes it's the case, looking at only one issue because it's the one that is very visible from stakeholders' point of view. But actually, due diligence is a lot broader than just identifying possible child rights abused, right? So where is the due diligence process sitting? And is it across the board that you do have due diligence on anti-corruption, on the environment, human rights, labor rights, and all those issues that companies can have to deal with? And then your accountability mechanism. How do you report on possible issues? What are the remedies? So here the governance piece is basically how you get started on what will come next. And then for each one of those issues, you do have those expectations on how to get started for companies of all size. Obviously, the issues are not the same. If you're an SME and you don't have a supply chain, you'll not look at the 10 principles the same way as a big company with one and even multiple supply chain, depending on your product lines.
Great, thanks. I think that's a good answer. So looking at the COP is maybe a good place to start for an SME, and there's a lot of resources on that as well on UN Global Compact's website. But I know that you also have some e-learning courses and tools. I think we have a few more minutes. Maybe you can just introduce them so people can see some options available to get started.
Yes, so we just developed an e-learning course together with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and Shift. Shift is actually a really great organization based in New York, but also in different countries, with the mission or the objective to help companies and others understand the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and implement them. So together with those, well, the Office of the High Commissioner and with some support from Shift, we developed this e-learning course on human rights due diligence. It's a tool that is meant to be understood and applicable to all companies of all size. And it's more like an introduction course for companies who wants to understand what due diligence is about. For companies who are more advanced on this topic, this can also be used for capacity building purposes with suppliers, for example, or business partners. We've released the first 2 modules and we'll be releasing modules 3 and 4 shortly. So these are currently only available in English, but they will soon be available in different languages as well. And they are quite short, so easy to follow. We are currently developing something very similar for the labor principles, the 4 labor principles, plus occupational safety and health based on that tool. So we'll have e-learning courses for all 6 of the social principles. And I don't remember if I just mentioned it, but it's accessible to everybody, right? It's free, a free resource that you can access today if you wish. And together with that e-learning course, we also have what we call the Business and Human Rights Navigator. It's the revamp of a tool that we had, which was called the Business and Human Rights Dilemmas Forum. So for those of you who may have seen the Dilemmas Forum, it's the same idea. And for that, we've developed basically different pieces on key human rights topics and labor rights topics with examples of possible challenges and ways to resolve these challenges. Basically, they are dilemmas, right? So the typical dilemmas that companies may face in the course of their operations. So this is going to be launched Q1 next year, and we'll keep expanding on it. So for now, we'll have, for example, a dilemma on child labor, we'll have a dilemma on forced labor, a dilemma on living wage. Obviously, due diligence is the umbrella through which we look at those issues. And coming up, we'll add more and more on Aboriginal rights, for example, freedom of speech. We will have one also on freedom of association. So our 4 principles will be covered for sure, plus a few additional ones as a first step. So with those 2 resources, plus all the ones that I briefly mentioned that were developed through the Decent Work Action Platform, it forms a pretty good package to understand human rights risks, labor rights, as well as how to advance principles and decent work in own operations and supply chains.
Great, thank you so much, Marilu. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions, and we are going to share the slides with everyone after this event. So please feel free to look back at the slides because I know there's a lot of information here and a lot of tools that you can go back and look at. So thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I think we will move on to the next part of the event, which will focus on the environmental side. So thanks so much, Marilu. It was really interesting to hear from you.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, let me just share our next slides. Okay, so for the next part of the event, as I mentioned, it will focus on the environmental aspects of reporting on supply chain sustainability. So we're going to hear from CDP, Velux, and Spti. Starting off with CDP now, our next speaker, Hugo Ernest Jones, is CDP Europe's Associate Director, Supply Chain Europe. He's leading the supply chain program for CDP in Europe based in Berlin, and he's engaging suppliers of European multinationals, including L'Oreal, for example, to disclose their climate change, deforestation, and water security data through CDP and take action to reduce their impacts. So Hugo is going to cover how companies can utilize CDP's questionnaires and the supply chain program to engage and disclose. So Hugo, thank you for joining. I'll pass it to you now.
Thanks so much, Alison, for the introduction, for the invitation, and also Marilu for the really interesting first section of the presentations for today. Yeah, very glad to join you today. As Alison said, I lead the supply chain program for CDP in Europe. I'm myself based in Berlin. And for those of you that are new to CDP, just wanted to give you a kind of quick introduction, which you can see on the next slide, which is that CDP is an international not-for-profit organization. We've been operating since the year 2000, and we run the world's largest environmental reporting system for companies, cities, states, and regions to report their environmental impact data, including on the supply chain side, and to share that with their interested stakeholders. So the system that we have can be used both as a platform to report corporate environmental impacts and as a way to get visibility of supply chain impacts by asking suppliers to disclose their impacts and to share that with their interested stakeholders. We work with over 590 investors with assets of over 110 trillion US dollars. And then on the supply chain side, we work with over 200 large purchasing organizations with procurement spend of over $5 trillion to request their suppliers to disclose their environmental data through the platform. And the way sort of CDP's theory of change works is that we believe that by transparently reporting on environmental impacts, risks, and opportunities, this can drive positive change in two particular ways. So first, it facilitates more effective action by the company that themselves are reporting. The actual process of going through the different components of the questionnaire can help to identify gaps and opportunities for improvement. And it also informs better decision making by their stakeholders, which integrate this data both into their investment decisions or into their procurement and purchasing decisions. And you can see on the next slide an overview of the members that we work with, including 15 companies in the Nordics, including Velux, who we'll be hearing from shortly, as well as Volvo Car, for example, Ørsted, and Electrolux. And these companies work with us to engage their suppliers to report their environmental data, including on Scope 3 emissions, as well as water and deforestation impacts through our system, so that they can then assess supplier readiness for the low carbon transition, but also gain visibility of their own supply chain impacts and report those back in their own CDP response to their key stakeholders. So on the next slide, you can see this is actually based on CDP data that we've been collecting over the last few years. We find that while companies have a handle on how they're managing impacts in their operations, it's now becoming the new market expectation for corporates to take responsibility of their whole value chain's environmental impacts. And that's also why, as Kenzo will talk about later, the science-based target criteria includes this focus on Scope 3 as well. And we found from our own data that we've collected over the years that supply chain emissions are on average 11.4 times higher than the company's direct emissions. So this supplier buyer kind of interaction can really make or break whether our economy can halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 as demands that we need to. So global corporations have these supply chains that wrap around the world, and therefore there's this huge potential for companies to drive climate action at scale through using their procurement spend as a leverage tool, as a lever to introduce kind of KPIs to suppliers and collaborate with them to reduce their environmental impacts. And we found also that suppliers report cost savings as a result of the emission reduction initiatives that they're implementing. And in the language of procurement, cost saving is a kind of useful way to frame some of the benefits of this kind of engagement. Suppliers specifically reported combined savings of $33 billion in 2020 as a result of the emissions emissions reductions initiatives they were implementing. So a clear kind of commercial incentive for taking action as well. And on the next slide, just to give you a quick overview of the number of companies that we currently work with to disclose data through our system, we had over 13,000 companies worth over 64% of total global market capitalization reporting their data through CDP on climate change, water and forests in 2021. And the overall number of disclosures actually grew by over 35% this year, and has actually increased by over 140% since the Paris Agreement in 2015. So we're seeing really a lot more interest, transparency, and kind of commitment from companies when it comes to reporting their environmental data, and a greater awareness of the climate and ecological emergency that we're currently facing. So let's take a quick look at the supply chain data that's reported through CDP. This is just an overview. On the left, you can see the CDP questionnaire kind of in full and the different sections that we asked the companies to respond to. On the right side, we've pulled out those sections that relate specifically to supply chain data as it connects to climate change. So the first thing we ask companies about is the governance of supply chain impact. So we ask companies to provide details about any incentives they might have for example, their chief procurement officer or buyer or purchasing contacts internally to engage with suppliers and manage those impacts. So that could be something like a financial incentive to ensure a certain level of disclosure from a group of suppliers that individual is working with, or that suppliers are setting a climate target or reporting emissions. So governance is a really key internal mechanism to help push cascade engagement through the supply chain. And then there are a lot of qualitative details that sit in the risks and opportunities section of the questionnaire in section 2. So this is how companies can explain the processes that they have for assessing and managing climate risks and opportunities in their upstream value chain, and any specific risks and opportunities that are substantial for their company that could be due to, for example, physical or transitional risks. Then in the business strategy section, this enables companies to explain how their supplier engagement or their value chain engagement strategy has been influenced by these risks and opportunities that they've disclosed in the previous section. So they can really sort of describe the influence that this is having on the strategic decisions that the company is making, and how working with suppliers is helping to mitigate those risks. Then very importantly, the next section looks at targets and asks companies to disclose any emissions reduction targets that they have on scope 3, which are often a key component of their science-based targets as well. The next section also then enables companies to report any initiatives that they're implementing to help meet these targets. So that could be collaborative projects that they're implementing with their suppliers to encourage them to switch to renewable electricity, anything they're implementing in their supplier codes of conduct or policies that require them to meet certain KPIs. So that's where companies can really report tangible actions that they're taking with their suppliers to meet those targets. And then, of course, a really key component in all of this is the company's reporting of their own Scope 3 data. So in section 6, we ask companies to report their overall Scope 3 emissions, and particularly their supply chain emissions, as well as whether those emissions have been verified by a third party to indicate the sort of quality of the data that's coming through. Some companies will also be implementing quite progressive initiatives to put, for example, carbon pricing on their supplier engagement. So looking at the carbon price of working with a particular supplier versus working with another. And then finally, companies can also provide information on the percentage of the suppliers that they're engaging with to reduce emissions. So they can talk about the percentage of spend that represents, and typically sort of 60 to 80% is a pretty good benchmark, but also maybe looking at it in the absolute number of suppliers that they are working with. So we've had a quick look as well on the next slide at one or two KPIs among Nordic suppliers who reported to CDP this year to see what they had disclosed. And as you can see, most companies that disclosed in the Nordics were reporting their Scope 1 emissions, and then around half or slightly less reporting their Scope 2 emissions, either location-based or market-based. So typically we do see that awareness of these operational emissions is higher. But when you look at Scope 3, only 31% of responding suppliers were reporting their Scope 3 purchase goods and services emissions. And while this is, as we flagged earlier, often where a lot of the impacts are lying, the visibility of exactly what those emissions are was relatively low overall. So that's often because Scope 3 is a more complex type of emissions accounting, but very important to get that initial visibility. That said, actually, we found that 69% of all disclosing suppliers in the Nordics reported engaging with their own suppliers to reduce impacts. So whereas the specifics of the emissions on Scope 3 may not be incredibly high, the level of engagement is actually is fairly substantial, that many companies are actually looking at working with their suppliers to reduce those emissions. In terms of the specific things that these companies are doing to or things that they're trying to incentivize with their suppliers, if we look on the next slide, we've just pulled out a couple of the KPIs that most members will ask their suppliers to disclose on, and the specific steps they would like them to put into place. So typically most members will ask their suppliers, first of all, to disclose their emissions data. So most importantly, for their own Scope 3 emissions accounting would be the supplier's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And this is really the foundation for everything that kind of follows on from that, particularly setting a target and demonstrating progress towards that target over time, and then implementing initiatives to meet that target. So certainly switching to renewables, renewable electricity, perhaps in the first instance, and then tracking emissions reductions that are occurring as a result of those initiatives. In terms of the types of targets that our members are asking suppliers to set, we're very much pushing science-based targets throughout the supply chain. So encouraging their own suppliers to follow the criteria for setting a 1.5 degree aligned science-based target. And then among the most advanced suppliers, members are encouraging them to engage with their own suppliers. So the kind of cascade of that engagement down to the next tier of the supply chain and so on, as well as engaging with other members of civil society. And just on the final slide, I wanted to include this one to sort of demonstrate what the impact of this engagement is over time. And again, this sort of follows CDP's theory of change, in that by asking for this information, we do see a correlation with an improvement in supplier performance over time. We typically, the first time we ask a group of suppliers to disclose through CDP, 38% of them will be doing something already to reduce their emissions. But by the third time we ask that group of suppliers to disclose, 69% will be doing something to reduce their emissions. And similarly with target setting as well, 50% will already have a target in place in the first year of their reporting, but by the third year, 66 will have a target in place. So essentially by kind of engaging suppliers in this way, asking for this information, we catalyze some action and improvement performance over time. So I think I'm at time there, Alison. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everybody, for your time.
Thank you so much, Hugo. I think that was a great introduction to CDP, a closer look at the questionnaires and also the supply chain program. And it's great to see that, that this is going to start having a ripple effect through supply chains as larger companies ask their partners and value chains to start reporting and setting targets as well. So with that, we will also have a presentation from Velux, who is using CDP's reporting frameworks. And we'll also hear from the Science Based Targets Initiative on sort of the target setting aspect that Hugo was mentioning as well. So I think this will be a great segue into our next speaker. But please feel free to send questions in the chat. We will have sort of a panel Q&A at the end. But next, I'm very happy to introduce David Collins. He's Supplier Quality Director at Velux, and he's responsible for the Scope 3 Carbon Impact Initiative coordination throughout the company. And to give you some background, Velux is a Nordic company providing window products and solutions. They're members in CDP's supply chain program, and they're engaging and reporting on their supply chain through various methods, which we're looking forward to hearing David present. So David, I'll pass it to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Is that a quick sound check there? Everything
Yes,
okay?
we can hear you. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay. Yes, as thank you for that good introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak here, but also to see the input that we've had from other contributors as well. It's quite a wide-ranging topic, and I think across the whole sustainability and Global Compact initiative, there's a lot of aspects that are overlapping throughout the organizations. And you can see this in a lot of code of conducts and various other aspects that are brought into play with larger and global companies. If we just take a look at our particular company now, Velux has always had a history of being on the front foot when it comes to all things sustainable. And most recently, It's Our Nature initiative that's been launched agrees to put us on the most ambitious target, heading for a 1.5 degree global warming effect. We are also introducing a 100% carbon neutral for our scope 1 and 2 operations. We're aiming to have that in place by 2030. And we're looking for a 50% reduction of CO2 from our value chain. So that's essentially where we're coming from. And I think if you have a look at the next slide, you can see some numbers of what we've done with our supply chain. Now, I would hasten to add that these numbers are indicative and they are proportionally correct, but not numerically correct, obviously, because some of that's IP as well. So take the numbers as a proportional representation, though not an empiric value. We engaged with CDP some time ago after we committed to the SBTi pathway for our 1.5 degree ambition. And the idea was that we would identify the largest proportion of our supply chain that had the biggest impact on our carbon footprint in our scope 3. And very much like you saw earlier, our scope 3 contribution to our carbon footprint is something in the region of 93, 94%. So it's a very large proportion. The concept is that dealing with these 80% contributors in our supply chain is going to give us the biggest ability to move the needle and make a difference over the coming years. And we have to remember that with our target based at 2030, that's not very many years away. You can see from the chart in front of you, we have specific areas that are key contributors in our material supply chain. And approximately 80% of these suppliers are through direct materials, and the spend is requested through CDP. We engaged with CDP 2 years ago, and we had a first year of reporting with a very strong showing from our supply chain of respondents. What we did find from that initial round was that we have a proportion of suppliers that are quite well focused in what they're doing. Proportionally, we're looking at something like 12 out of the 134 were directly reporting through SBTi already. We also had a proportion of these suppliers that had some form of carbon footprint reduction knowledge or metrics in place within their organization, but way north of 50% had nothing really currently in place and were either unable to report through CDP or not in a position to be able to through lack of knowledge in their organization. So we sort of sat back and thought, right, how can we do this? And there's two ways of doing it. There's the carrot and stick, and there's the combination of the two. And really what we thought about doing is that reducing the carbon footprint and value chain has a cost, and it has an impact somewhere throughout that supply chain. And talking to some of our suppliers, there was a real feeling within some of them that it's something they didn't have to do right now, that it was something that was going to be very expensive to do right now, that it was going to be something that was very complicated to do right now. So we decided on a strategy far more carrot than stick. So what we've effectively done is set up our own group within our organization to act to support the supply chain. And what we'll be doing with that, if you can see on the next slide, what we'll be doing with this is to work with the suppliers to bring them up to a lowest common level of carbon footprint reporting within scope 1, 2, and 3. Now, to do that, we're holding webinars with our suppliers and with CDP to encourage the data stream to come in through CDP. Now, there's a small proportion that will not either want to go through CDP or for some reason or another go in other ways of reporting. So what we've done is we've set up a sort of starter kit or a beginner's guide to supply chain carbon footprint reporting. And with that, we're encouraging our suppliers to use those sort of starter kit tools to do their declarations in through CDP or direct to us if they feel a bit more comfortable doing that. And the data is in a form in which that we can feed into our modeling that we then use to report into Spti. So where we're going is, instead of spending a lot of time with the suppliers that are already well advanced, we're working from the bottom up and saying, okay, the suppliers that don't have a great deal of maturity in understanding their carbon footprint, we're going to support them. So we've now got a group that we've recruited internally that will be going out to the suppliers and holding workshops with the supply chain, working through the starter kit that we've put together with them, but also showing them and encouraging them how to respond into CDP. And one of the positive responses we had from these suppliers that we've engaged with so far is that they're realizing that at some point in the future, they're going to have to do it anyway. So having someone to hold their hand through these early stages and making them realize that it's not a huge beast that is going to suck in lots of resource and lots of cost within the organization has been a real focal point and catalyst here. There's almost an epiphany that switches on that you don't need to create new processes, new procedures, and new metrics. If you see carbon footprint and carbon as a currency within the organization, and perhaps a fourth KBI above and beyond quality, delivery, and cost, then you can actually work it into a lot of your current systems already. And if you can convert the carbon footprint of the materials, products, and services that you purchase into a form of currency, we're using it through SAP, you can actually funnel that through your organization, and it helps you create and analyze your own carbon footprint as much as it does with the supply chain. So from that point of view, it's giving us a benefit, but it's giving the supply chain a benefit as well. So if we absorb some of that cost ourselves and provide this as a service to our supply chain, everybody wins. The suppliers get a foot up in their first encouraging steps towards looking at their carbon footprint, but also there's the data is coming through in a form in which we can make far better use of it, so we don't get data in lots of different forms. It's also in a form that is easy to report into CDP, not necessarily the whole declaration, but certainly from a carbon footprint point of view. And they're also realizing that there's other customers knocking on the door looking for this sort of information, and now they can say they've actually got it available. So first of all, they're reporting through CDP, but second of all, they've already got the data in a form in which goes and fits in quite snugly with some of the carbon trust and SBTi modeling that is required for those declarations. So it's very much a win-win situation for what is seen by us as a relatively small investment, certainly for the future of our operations and for the future of our business. Okay. So where we're actually reporting this out is we do an annual report that's in a SBTi form, even though we may not actually submit that to the SBTi every year. Our auditors, Ernst & Young, have a half-yearly report. So we do a mid-year report and an end-of-year report, which is then worked into our financial reporting for the year. And we also do an internally carbon footprint report, which we publish every quarter, that gives a lifetime feel of where our carbon footprint's going. The last thing we really want to do is sort of end up at the end of the year and then realize our carbon footprint went the wrong way. So it's very important to have a dynamic metric that you can use throughout the year. We've created our own carbon factor database, which we use as an as-in carbon footprint. And the modeling we use can also extrapolate where we are now and project where we could be if we follow what we're currently doing in 25 and 30 going forward. And basically this gives the following deliverables. It gives us our reductions with targets internally and externally. It enables us to produce our carbon footprint and growth, but it also, because of these dynamic inputs, gives us a good opportunity to do scenario modeling and what ifs. Okay, I think that's time.
Okay, thanks so much, David. It was great to see how you're incorporating all of these things, especially after hearing from UN Global Compact and CDP about the different frameworks, seeing how you've sort of brought it together in your own strategy. So I think, as you mentioned, you were talking about science-based targets. So we're going to hear from our next speaker from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then we'll come back for a panel Q&A. And I think, yeah, it will be interesting to hear a bit more from all of you. But for our next speaker, I'm very happy to have Kenza Taufik here with us. She's the European Regional Lead for CDP's Commit to Action program, and she works with European companies, engaging and supporting them to commit to and develop science-based emission reduction targets through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So this is sort of the target setting aspect of what both Hugo and David have been talking about. So Kenza, we're looking forward to hearing from you and a bit more about the Scope 3 criteria.
Thanks very much, Alison, and hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. First of all, many thanks to the UNGC Nordic Networks for the invitation to participate in this event. As mentioned by Alison, I'm part of CDP's Commit to Action team and the Sbti corporate engagement team responsible for the European region. I'm delighted to be here today to provide an introduction to science-based targets, who we are, what we're doing, and also give you an overview of the most important things you need to know about setting a Scope 3 target. To reach that goal, we'll start with defining science-based targets, then dive into the Scope 3 criteria and requirements, and finally see what changes are planned by the SBTi in the next few months. So let's start with what are science-based targets, but first of all, what is the Science-Based Target Initiative? The SBTi was founded in 2015 as a collaboration between 4 partner organizations, so WWF, the World Resources Institute, the UNGC, and CDP. And the goal of the SBTi is to drive ambitious climate action in the private sector by enabling companies to set emissions reductions targets, which are based on science and which are consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as the numbers on this slide illustrate, the initiative has had very strong traction, with now almost 2,200 companies in total having joined the SBTi. 1,100 companies of which have committed to align their reductions with a 1.5 degree future by joining the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign. So what are science-based targets, or SBTs, as we often refer to them? SBTs are short to medium term corporate emissions reductions target that are in line with the level of decarbonization needed to limiting global warming to within 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And they are also a key tool to prepare for and accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. So to put it in simple terms, SBTs help companies determine how much and how fast they can or they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So this really means that they are the stepping stones that companies need to take on the way to the long-term goal of net zero and reaching that by 2050. And of course, along the way, we ask companies to annually disclose, so it is easier to track the progress against the targets. So why do companies set science-based targets? What are the business drivers behind? The first reason is to seize and take advantage of opportunities within the low carbon transition. For example, by innovating on the development of low carbon products or services. It is also to anticipate regulatory and policy development. We are seeing more and more ambitious national climate targets that are being announced, and these will over time become the norm. So by setting science-based targets, companies can stay ahead of the curve on regulation and mitigate transition risks. Additionally, there is inherent competitiveness behind the low carbon transition, for example, by minimizing energy or emissions related costs. And finally, and probably more importantly, it is to address expectations from stakeholders, including customers, but mostly investors who are now expecting companies to have these kind of robust targets in place in order to future-proof the business for the low carbon transition. I'll now provide an overview of the Spti journey. So the first step is the commitment, and I'll talk a little bit more about the different commitment options in a moment. But once a company commits, this kicks off a 24-month period where they have publicly demonstrated a commitment to setting science-based targets. And within that time, they will model their target, submit it to the Sbti for validation, and announce the target publicly. Once the target is approved by the Sbti, that's where the real work starts, and companies implement and also track and disclose the progress against the target. Currently, there are two ways to commit to the Sbti. There's a standard commitment letter and the SME target setting form. The standard letter, in the standard letter, companies commit to set near-term science-based targets. So these are 5 to 10 year targets. And in addition, they can also choose to set net zero targets. Committing to net zero is not mandatory, but the Sbti highly encourages companies to choose the highest level of ambition by ticking the net zero box in the standard letter. The other route is the SME target setting form that is available to all companies that fit the Sbti's definition of an SME, which is a non-subsidiary independent company with fewer than 500 employees. And within that form, there are predetermined options which the SMEs can choose from. So let's move on to the criteria and recommendation and dive a little bit deeper into what the scope 3 requirements are. So once the commitment has been made by a company, they will have to get to work on the second step of actually setting and developing the targets. How can companies get started? The first step is for them to understand their own emissions and quantify them. So a greenhouse gas emissions inventory is mandatory. The Spti asks that companies calculate their inventory in line with what the greenhouse gas protocol says. And on the slide, we can see the breakdown of emissions across different scopes, depending on where within the value chain they lie. So once the company has a complete greenhouse gas inventory, they can start the target setting process using the Spti criteria and recommendation document that is available on our website. I'll give you a quick overview of the 6 most important criteria. The first one is the level of ambition. The minimum level of ambition for scopes 1 and 2 is a well below 2-degree alignment, but the Spti has been encouraging this alignment with 1.5 degrees since 2019. And from next year in July onward, we will only be accepting 1.5 degree alignments for scope 1 and 2. And I will get back to this a bit later in the presentation. The second criterion is that progress so that the science-based targets need to be forward-looking. We also have the boundary criterion where we ask companies to set targets that cover at least 95% of company-wide Scope 1 and 2 emissions, so only a maximum of 5% combined can be excluded. The time frame of Sbts right now is 5 to 15 years into the future, but this will be shortened as well to 5 to 10 years in the new version of the criteria. In terms of reporting, we ask companies to annually disclose their greenhouse gas inventory and progress against the targets in a public fashion. And finally, for Scope 3, companies need to conduct a full screening of their Scope 3 emissions. And if that screening shows that 40% or more of the total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions come from Scope 3, then we ask you to set an ambitious and measurable Scope 3 target. So let's look into Scope 3. First of all, it is very important to know that the SBTi provides more flexibility around Scope 3 targets compared with Scope 1 and 2, both in terms of boundary and level of ambition. The first very important part where we offer more flexibility for Scope 3 target is the boundary of the target. So as mentioned before, the boundary for Scope 1 and 2 is 95%, whereas Scope 3 needs to cover 2/3, so about 67% of your Scope 3 emissions. And this is really to account for the fact that most companies, even those that have started their journey 10 years ago, still struggle to accurately calculate and drive down emissions across their entire value chain. So we really want to see companies start the journey, understand their own value chain, and identify hotspots on which they can work. There are different options for companies to set a Scope 3 target, and we can categorize them in 2 buckets, let's say. The first one is to set your own target, and the second bucket is to ask suppliers to set science-based targets themselves. And this second one makes specifically sense for companies if the portion of emissions that you have in the purchased goods and service category, so from the products that you buy from suppliers, is very high. So these are the 3 options that companies have to set your own Scope 3 targets. The first one is to use the absolute contraction method with a minimum level of a 2-degree alignment. So it is allowing a lower level of ambition as compared to Scope 1 and 2. And this currently translates as 1.23% absolute reduction per year. The second option is to set intensity targets, which are either modeled on the sector decarbonization approach, so for setting physical intensity targets, or using the economic-based approach, which is a 7% year-on-year reduction per unit of added value. And the third option available is to set physical intensity targets based on the physical indicator of your choice, and that leads to a 2% intensity reduction per year. But at the same time, these targets cannot lead to absolute emissions growth. And in addition, or instead of these options, companies can choose to ask their suppliers or customers to set science-based targets themselves. And with actually many companies having a very big portion of their emissions in Scope 3, more and more companies across the world start tackling this really important portion of the emissions by directly engaging and collaborating with their suppliers on ambitious target setting and on emissions reductions. And we have seen the perfect example now with Dave and Felix. So moving on to the second bucket, or the supplier engagement target, I would first like to emphasize that no matter which target setting approach a company uses for Scope 3, they will need to work on engaging their suppliers in order to drive down their upstream emissions to meet their target. So under this approach, companies commit to having a specific percentage of suppliers to set their own science-based target within 5 years from the date that the company's target is submitted to the SBTi. So this is really using the power of procurement to cascade climate action down the supply chain. The formulation of, in terms of formulation of the target, companies can set the target to cover a specific percentage, either by spend or by greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of timeline, as just mentioned, suppliers covered by the company's target need to set science-based targets within 5 years from the date that the target is set. And this provides the company time to engage and educate their suppliers, but also minimizes pushing reductions out into the future, since the overall goal is to reduce emissions as much and as quickly as possible. One other note is that supplier engagement targets are not recommended when the majority of category 1 emissions, so the purchased goods and services, come from tier 2 suppliers or suppliers that are even further removed from the reporting company, as it might be difficult to exert influence upon them. The SBTi has developed and is currently finalizing a supplier engagement toolkit, which will be launched in January and will be able to help companies start the engagement with their suppliers. And now moving on to the last piece, which is about the new criteria changes that have been announced by the SBTi. So in the past few months, many changes were announced by the SBTi, including the unveiling of a new SBTi strategy. And the target setting framework of the SBTi was based on a 2-degree trajectory originally, but this has changed over time, particularly with the publication of the IPCC report in 2018. So science is now saying that the aim is no longer 2 degrees, but it is 1.5 degrees. And 1.5 has become the new normal for companies to set SBTs, as about 70% of all targets validated in 2021 alone were aligned with a 1.5 degree future. So as a result, the decision was taken to raise this minimum level of ambition across all 3 scopes. The SBTi has developed version number 5 of the criteria, which will come into force on July 15th of next year. And all targets submitted from that date onward will need to align with the new changes. So what are these 3 changes? The first one is that scope 1 and 2 ambition is increasing from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. Scope 3 is increasing from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. And also the time frame is changing. So with the increased urgency, it is shortened to 5 to 10 years instead of 5 to 15 years. Just to conclude, the SBTi has a wide variety of resources available on our website that can support you in your target setting journey, including tools, guidance documents, and online trainings. I also would like to invite you to check the video of the Net Zero Standard launch that took place on October 28th, and I've linked it at the bottom of this slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kenza, for that great look at SBTi and a closer look at scope 3, which I think is a key area for a lot of companies. And we also get a lot of questions about that. And I can see that we're getting some questions in the chat already. So I think we will go into our Q&A portion, which will focus on the Q&A for the environmental side. So now we have CDP, VLUX, and Science Based Targets Initiative with Kenza. I think we'll start with some of the questions in the chat. So Kenza, this is a question for you. If we send in the commitment now, the base year will be during the pandemic, which is not relevant since consumption levels are not around the accurate level. So is it possible to use 2019 as a base year instead?
Thank you for this question. And the answer is yes. We recognize at the SBTI that 2020 was a very special year due to COVID, and we exceptionally allow companies to use a 2019 base year throughout 2022 when they want to submit targets.
Great, thanks. I think that's a commonly asked question as well. And then we have a question here about when the new criteria will be published, but I think that's already published, right? You're just saying they come into effect next summer, is that correct?
Exactly. So the criteria, the version number 5 was published on October 28th. It is already available on the SBTI website and will be or will come into force on the 15th of July 2022. So until then, companies can choose either the version 4.2 or version number 5 to set criteria, to set targets. And from the July 15th, all targets that are submitted will have to be, will have to follow the version number 5.
Right. And also we just have the recent launch, as you mentioned, of the net zero standard. So that's another thing that's recently published that I think is worth looking at for companies interested in setting net zero targets. So we have another question also directed to you, Kenza. 2/3 of scope 3 emissions, is that 67% of spend or number of suppliers or partners or something else? Can you maybe clarify a bit?
Yes, so it's 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions of your inventory. It is not directly related to suppliers or partners. It is your own emissions.
Okay, great. And then I think this question can be directed maybe to Hugo at CDP as well, and Kenza. A question that we hear often from companies is that with the greenhouse gas protocol, there's many categories of scope 3. And for many companies, they have good data on one category, maybe not so much on others. So how do you sort of balance this? And do they need to report in detail on all categories according to the greenhouse gas protocol, or can they focus on some where the data quality is high?
I can, or Hugo, you can go first, and I can maybe add on.
happy to sort of give my view on this in any case first. But yeah, so I think the key thing we would emphasize to companies that are kind of getting started on this scope 3 reporting journey is really to focus, first of all, where the most material impacts are. So if by going through this kind of screening process, you identify that the most material impacts in your scope 3 emissions are coming from use of sold products or the supply chain side, then focusing first of all on getting the accounting accurate for those makes sense. But then the screening exercise for another company, perhaps one that's working in the services industry, might identify business travel as being the kind of most relevant category to start accounting for in scope 3. So I think ideally, when creating a scope 3 inventory, the more comprehensive, the better. But once getting started, certainly identifying which kind of parts of the value chain feels like the most likely from an impact perspective and starting there. Once you're confident with that, then moving on to those that are less material.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And Kenza, what about from SBTI's perspective?
I will second what Hugo just said. He basically covered it for us as well from the SBTI side. We ask companies to really look at what type of data they have, where they have the most significant impact, and start with those areas. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. And we have another question here in the chat. Companies are confused on which standards to follow while they are reporting. How would you suggest a company to understand which standard is adequate for them? So I think that question can apply to all of the speakers here. I mean, also Dave, from your perspective, maybe you can chime in on how you decided which to go with CDP, for example, or which reporting standard was best for you.
So I was just having a bit of trouble with the mute button.
No problem.
Yeah, basically, we set up a modeling system in conjunction with Carbon Trust, rather. And I think what would be a good practice with a lot of people is to engage with a company like Carbon Trust to set up a modeling that works, and then fix on one specific criteria. So I'm not quite sure if we could actually use brand names here, but things like the global standard databases like EcoEvent and Garby. One of them is fixated or fixed more around physical products, so in kilograms or weight or mass, and one's fixed more around spend. So I think it's a question of finding a standard that fits your business best. So like, for example, if you're going to go for one that specifically focuses on mass of product, if you're a manufacturing company, or perhaps spend if you're a service industry, and then sticking with that. So pick one and stick to it. There isn't one out there that does everything. So you'll never get a perfect fit. But the worst case scenario is mixing databases or mixing standards. So my advice would be pick one and stick to it, and get the modeling that you're actually going to use or submit validated by a group like Carbon Trust.
Great, thanks, Dave. And Kenza, Hugo, do you have any advice on how companies, when they're looking at all the standards that are out there? I know we even went through some UN Global Compact's principles, CDP's different questionnaires, SBTI. What is your recommendation as well?
I couldn't go next. So when it comes to reporting, we ask companies to base their progress on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard. So there's no specific requirements regarding where the inventory should be disclosed, as long as it is public. Of course, we do recommend CDP as a platform, but other options could be annual reports, sustainability reports, and also like using the own company website.
Kenza, maybe just to kind of add on to that, from the CDP side, I think what we try and do with the platform that we provide is to provide alignment in the questions that we're asking with other frameworks that exist. So certainly, the way that the SBTI looks at target setting is closely kind of integrated with our methodology for reporting on targets, but then also other frameworks like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is integrated into the way that we also ask companies to account for the risks that they disclose to our system, as well as following the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the GRI, and SASB, for example. So I think that's from our perspective, we try to create a framework that is aligned with the other frameworks that exist in the market.
Thanks. And I see we have another question here about the GHG protocol, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was just mentioned. So according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it is possible to specify a Scope 3 category as non-relevant. For example, an employee commuting because it's relatively small or no risk. So when setting a Scope 3 target, which covers 60% of emissions, we need to know what 100% are. So do those not relevant emissions count in part that 100%? So Kenza, I guess this is a question for you.
Yeah, thank you. So in short, yes, they do count, but then your company can choose this to set a target, including the most important categories that are relevant for you.
Okay, thank you. That was a straightforward answer. And Dave, we had a question for you earlier that you answered in the chat, but I think it might be worth looking at or maybe hearing a bit more about. The question was saying, do you have trouble getting suppliers to answer surveys and attend your seminars? We saw a lot of your different engagement programs. If so, how do you deal with that? So maybe building on that, like what strategies on supplier engagement have worked well for you? What hasn't? How do your suppliers respond to all of your outreach?
Okay, yeah, it's a really good question. And to be quite honest, I think there's two aspects. First of all, customers like ourselves, I think, start from the position that we think it's going to be difficult. So sometimes we make it difficult or we're reluctant to do it. But we found once you start actually engaging with suppliers, most of them have got some knowledge or realization that this is something that's inevitably going to come and they need a catalyst to get going. So a little bit of support and a little bit of engagement from us seems to have tipped a few over that edge to the starting point. But the other thing is there's also a perception that it's going to cost a lot of money or be very complicated. So we go in with this sort of simplified model that we can show, and that you're not going to have to suddenly recruit 5% extra SG&A to deal with this. Then I think that also helps. But I think it's the personal touch. I above everything else, I would say physically phone suppliers and talk to them, visit suppliers and talk to them if you can. Don't do cold mail drops, cold survey drops, send in an email, say, please respond to this survey or please fill this data. Phone the people up, the carbon-based life forms at the other end of the phone, talk to them, and you'd be surprised how easy it can be.
Thanks, that's good advice. And what about within your own company? So you talk about engaging your key supplier groups, and what departments have you engaged within your company, and maybe what kind of capacity did it take for you?
Oh, we're completely across the board. I mean, this is driven very much by our family that still own our business. We're still a private company and run as a foundation. So this is really a very top-down driven initiative. So from that point of view, having had a history of sustainable building and various other initiatives over the past 15 years, it's kind of something that's come in naturally. But I do get the question quite often, how do you engage upper management if it's coming from a bottom-up initiative? And I think from that point of view, you can take two approaches. There's the cynical monetary mercenary approach, which is if you invest now, it'll be cheaper later. But there's also an aspect of, from a PR point of view, this is a good thing to do because it's becoming very much more high profile. There are many more questions being asked about it. So jump now before you're pushed. And again, I know that sounds a little bit cynical, but having spent 20 years in the automotive industry, I'm kind of used to that sort of environment. But put it into financial terms and into business terms tends to be the easiest way to make it bottom up.
Yes, I think that's a good point. Also, getting on top of it as things are coming out. We can already see in Norway with the Transparency Act that companies are going to need to report on human rights and labor, which Mari-Lou covered earlier. And yeah, we can see that science-based targets for nature are coming out. So I think before that comes out, you can set a target for climate. So yeah, that's a good point. I see that somebody has started writing a question in the chat. We don't have the rest there, but we have a few minutes left if anyone else has questions or wants to chime in. And if not, then I think we can wrap up today's event just a few minutes early. Thank you so much for all of our speakers today, to Mari-Lou from UN Global Compact, Kenza from Science Based Targets Initiative and CDP, Hugo from CDP, and David from Velux. We're very happy to have you today and get all of your input. And thank you very much to everyone who joined from the Nordics. And I know there's people from outside the Nordics and Europe as well. So thank you for joining today. We're going to send the recording and slides with all of the resources to you after this event, as soon as everything is ready. So thank you so much and have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.